Hearing will come to order. I want to apologize to the witnesses for the vote that is kind of making this a little bit discombobulated right now. I'll be starting, making my comments, then asking you for your testimony. Senator Markey is voting on the second vote now. He'll be joining us, making his statements, coming back after that, and then I will leave and go make the second vote. So but we don't want to delay the hearing any further. Thank you very much for your understanding in starting this a little bit late to begin with. Let me welcome you all to the 8th hearing for the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on East Asia, the Pacific, and International Cybersecurity Policy in the 115th Congress. This hearing will be the first hearing in a three-part series of hearings titled The China Challenge, and will examine how the United States should respond to the challenge of a rising China that seeks to upend and supplant the U.S.-led liberal world order. The Trump administration has been clear on the scope of the problem and gravity of the challenge before us. According to the National Security Strategy, for decades, U.S. policy was rooted in the belief that support for China's rise and for its integration into the post-war international order would liberalize China. Contrary to our hopes, China expanded its power at the expense of the sovereignty of others. According to the National Defense Strategy, the central challenge to U.S. prosperity and security is the reemergence of long-term strategic competition by what the National Security Strategy classifies as revisionist powers. It is increasingly clear that China and Russia want to shape a world consistent with their authoritarian model, gaining veto authority over other nations' economic, diplomatic, and security decisions. An opinion editorial in the Wall Street Journal last week noted the following: Xi Jinping has proclaimed that China has both the intent and capability to reshape the international order. Yet much of what passes for Chinese global leadership to date is simply the pursuit of China's own narrow interests. He has yet to demonstrate the key attributes of true global leadership: the willingness to align and in some cases subordinate Beijing's immediate interests to the greater global good, and the ability to forge a significant agreement around a global challenge. The question before us now is identifying the tools the United States has at its disposal to counter the disturbing developments posed by China's less than peaceful rise. This is why Senator Markey and I, and a bipartisan group of co-sponsors in the Senate, joined in introducing the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, or ARIA, on April 24th. The legislation sets a comprehensive policy framework to demonstrate U.S. commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific region and the rules-based international order. ARIA provides a comprehensive set of national security and economic policies to advance U.S. interests and goals in the Indo-Pacific region, including providing substantive U.S. resource commitments for these goals. I'm joined in this legislation on the committee by Senator Kaine, Senator Coons, Senator Cardin, Senator Markey, by Senator Rubio and Senator Young, as well as Senators Sullivan and Perdue and Graham. This legislation has broad unanimous support. On June 4th, the Wall Street Journal editorial board endorsed ARIA, stating, "Congress is trying to help with the bipartisan Asia Reassurance Initiative Act. The Senate bill affirms core American alliances with Australia, Japan, and South Korea, while calling for deeper military and economic ties with India and Taiwan. It notably encourages regular weapons sales to Taipei." The Chamber of Commerce has also endorsed ARIA, stating, "The U.S. Chamber of Commerce supports the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act of 2018 and thanks Senator Gardner for his efforts to strengthen U.S. strategic and economic relationships across the Indo-Pacific region. Particularly with regard to the legislation's economic goals, we appreciate the bill's focus on closer trade ties, stronger protections for intellectual property, and a renewed focus on trade facilitation. We look forward to working with Senator Gardner and the Congress to advance these important objectives." On June 21st, we received a joint letter from the State Department and the Department of Defense formally endorsing ARIA. The letter, which was signed by Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Mattis, states, "We value the ARIA's legislation's reaffirmation of the United States' security commitments to our Indo-Pacific allies and partners. Furthermore, ARIA's focus on promoting stronger regional economic engagement and its support for democracy, the rule of law, and the development of civil society is especially welcome as part of a diplomatically led whole-of-government approach to the Indo-Pacific region." I ask unanimous consent. I'm going to ask myself here. We'll put this in the record, both the letter as well as the editorial. I expect the full committee to mark this critical legislation up in the coming days. I hope for its quick passage by the full Senate in the near future. When Senator Markey joins us, we will turn to him for his opening comments. but I want to welcome both of our witnesses here today. Our first witness is Dan Blumenthal. Almost gave you a demotion there, Dan, who serves as Director of Asian Studies and Resident Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Mr. Blumenthal has both served in and advised the U.S. government on China issues for nearly 2 decades. From 2001 to 2004, he served as Senior Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia at the Department of Defense. Additionally, from 2006 to 2012, he served as a Commissioner on the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, including holding the position of Vice Chair in 2007. Welcome, welcome, Mr. Blumenthal, and thank you for your time and testimony and being with us today. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next witness and stall just a little bit more, if we can, for Senator Markey. Our second witness today is Eli Ratner, who serves as the Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for a New American Security. Mr. Ratner served from 2015 to 2017 as the Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, and from 2011 to 2012 in the Office of Chinese and Mongolian Affairs at the State Department. He also previously worked in the U.S. Senate as a professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and in the Office of Senator Joe Biden. Welcome, Mr. Ratner. Welcome back to the committee. Thank you for being here. And Mr. Blumenthal will go ahead with your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Senator Gardner, and thank you very much for your leadership on these issues and with the bill that you've been working so with your colleagues so fastidiously on, and so glad that it's getting some the press it deserves and hopefully the support within the Senate that it deserves as well. What I want to do in my short time, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions, is first, number one, put in context Chinese coercive practices in its grander strategy, then focus on some of the most targeted countries of Chinese coercive practices, including the United States, and then turn to some actions we might take both to defend ourselves but also to be a little bit more proactive against the Chinese Communist Party and its coercive economic practices. And I do think we have a lot of leverage there. So no surprise to anyone who's been following the subject, the Party Secretary General of the Communist Party and President Xi Jinping is following a very robust grand strategy of the China dream of national rejuvenation, rejuvenating the nation to become, again, the Middle Kingdom, the center of international politics and perhaps international economics as well. And he's doing a number of things to effectuate this China dream. Building up a world-class military, of course, is known to everybody who follows this topic, which has proceeded to advance its unlawful claims in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, and increasingly now does operations in India and further afield in the Gulf. And that military is a big part of its economic coercive strategies as well. So the military is one tool. Economic coercion is another tool of this grand strategy. We're waking up slowly to political warfare, political influence operations that seeks to build support in target nations for Chinese policies, or at least defend Chinese policies. United Front tactics, the Confucian Institutes, that a lot of the things your colleagues have focused on as well. So economic coercion, though, that's the topic of the day. I have to state that the era of reform and opening in China is over. It's been long over. It's been over probably for 10 years. And China is back to being run by state-owned enterprises that are related to the party. The private sector is diminishing. That provides the Chinese state with a lot more control over economic coercive policies. Some of the economic policies we don't like here in the United States are not necessarily coercive. They are predatory. It has to do with the mass subsidization of Chinese state-owned enterprises that make it uncompetitive for U.S. or other firms to compete with. It has to do with which has caused great dislocations inside the U.S. and other countries' labor markets. It has to do with the outright theft, of course, of intellectual property and trade secrets. That's theft. The coercive aspects, I think, when you talk about the United States, is the targeting of specific businessmen and businesses in order to do Chinese bidding. So, for example, in the latest round of tariffs with respect to what we've levied on China, the first thing that someone like Xi Jinping does is call in U.S. business friends to get them to go back home and lobby against any policies, whether you like them or not, that he doesn't see in their interests. And if you do abide by them as a U.S. corporation or European corporation, you will probably get favorable market access. If you don't abide by them, then you won't. So the specific targeting of U.S. businesses that China thinks can have influence in the U.S. political system is a major tool. China uses that same tool very much against Taiwan, which is kind of ground zero for Chinese economic coercion. And here I would say it's military and economic coercion. So the military is used to demonstrate to Taiwan that the Chinese, if they want to, can cut off Taiwan completely, its economic lifelines. Taiwan's an island nation and completely dependent on seaborne trade. The Chinese constantly exercise the ability to cut off their ability to exercise that seaborne trade. They also target Taiwanese businessmen to go vote for parties in Taiwan that they think will be more favorable to China, and are constantly cyber attacking, even just harassing Taiwanese businesses, as well as attracting talent away from the top Taiwanese tech companies. I'm running out of time in my opening statement, so let me just go through. Japan's another big target. Again, it's military and economic. We famously woke up to this in 2010 when there was a fishing dispute, and China decided that it was going to ban the exports of rare earth materials that were key to the Japanese economy. That woke up the markets, and there was a market response to that, but China has shown that it will continue to do so. It did the similar activities with respect to the Philippines in a dispute over the Scarborough Shoal. Not only does it use its military and quasi-military to cut off Filipino and Vietnamese fishermen from using fishing zones that that they are lawfully allowed to use, but also started to ban imports of important agricultural products from those two countries as well. And they're very dependent on those exports. They've cut cables of exploration ships. They've announced unilateral fishing bans, and they just continue to put overt military and economic pressure on countries' exclusive economic zones. Since I am out of time, let me quickly just offer a few ideas about how to fight back against this. I think we have to be more directive against what the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, cares about the most, and not use more scalpels rather than than big jackhammers. So the Chinese Communist Party has favored state-owned enterprises that are part of patronage networks. We could certainly ban some of those from accessing the U.S. market and the European market. Those are the two markets that matter the most. The U.S. consumer still fuels the Chinese economy. Ban the ones that are the worst offenders in intellectual property theft. Ban the ones that have benefited the most. Ban the ones that are closest to the party. Certainly, we should consider, in terms of escalation, how much party elites want their kids to come here to study. And I'm not saying ban all Chinese students. I'm saying if you want the party to stop acting in certain ways, go after what they care the most about. So if we identify party elites' children and so forth, and they want to come into the United States, we can certainly take a second and third look at their visas.
Let me just stop you right there, if I may, Mr. Blumenthal. I think you can probably get into more detail when we get into the question and answer period. So let me just stop you right there so we can begin with Mr. Ratner. And again, Mr. Eli Ratner is Vice President and Director of Studies, Center for a New American Security. We welcome you, sir. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Great. Senator Markey, Senator Kane, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Let me start by thanking Chairman Gardner and the other members of the committee for your efforts to reinforce America's enduring commitment to Asia. I'm encouraged to hear that the bipartisan Asia Reassurance Initiative Act will be marked up by the full committee. It's an important piece of legislation, and I share Senator Gardner's hope for quick passage by the full Senate. For the purposes of my opening statement today, I'm going to focus on the increasingly common and consequential phenomenon of Chinese economic coercion, whereby China is using economic punishments against governments and firms or threats thereof to advance its foreign policy and domestic political goals. My home institution, the Center for a New American Security, CNAS, released a report in June that represents the most detailed and comprehensive study to date on this phenomenon. I would encourage interested members and staff to read the report in its entirety. The report examines how Beijing is using economic coercion to advance its illiberal, authoritarian, and revisionist aims by employing a vast array of coercive economic tools, including import restrictions, popular boycotts, pressure on specific companies, export restrictions, limits on Chinese tourism, investment restrictions, and targeted financial measures. Beyond the immediate economic costs, these actions are having a damaging, chilling effect on the world. Facing the specter of Chinese retaliation, countries are less willing to stand up to China, and U.S. allies and partners are increasingly reluctant to work with the United States on certain diplomatic, economic, and military issues. In terms of how best to respond, my written testimony provides a dozen specific policy recommendations for Congress. Here are a few highlights. First, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee should hold hearings on the costs and benefits of rejoining the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Rejoining TPP is among the most important things we can do to advance our economic position in Asia and erode the effectiveness of China's economic coercion. By contrast, U.S. withdrawal has done substantial damage to our standing in the region and is facilitating the development of a Chinese sphere of influence in Asia and beyond. Rejoining TPP would renew confidence in the credibility and commitment of the United States, help to reroute supply chains in the region, open new markets for U.S. companies, and ultimately reduce China's economic leverage. It would also provide a mechanism for coordinating with allies and partners to combat China's predatory policies. Second, Congress should pass legislation to constrain President Trump's ability to levy tariffs against U.S. allies and partners on specious national security grounds. The United States will be far less successful if we attempt to address China's coercive actions on our own. Instead, we should be working closely with allies and partners, sharing information on Chinese activities, coordinating on trade and investment restrictions, and rerouting global supply chains. Unfortunately, the Trump administration's tariffs against some of our closest allies and partners have diluted attention away from China's predatory practices and made it far more difficult to coordinate on the China challenge. Third, we have to engender the focus and political will to enhance U.S. competitiveness. Bolstering our own national strength and staying at the cutting edge of technology and innovation are essential to reducing China's coercive capacity. This will mean continuing to support increases in basic research, investing in education, pursuing responsible fiscal policies, developing strategic visa and immigration policies, and generating a bipartisan consensus on the importance of rising to this occasion. Succeeding in the China challenge is ultimately about us, about our own national competitiveness, not just taking defensive measures to deal with China's predatory practices. In this context, I also support bipartisan legislation, co-sponsored by members of this committee, that mandates the administration to publish a national economic security strategy. Fourth, the effectiveness of China's economic coercion is based in large part on perceptions, and often misperceptions, of China's ascension and American decline. This leaves a vital role for greater U.S. public diplomacy, information operations, and strategic messaging to expound the strengths of the United States and to cast a more skeptical shadow on certain elements of China's leadership, government, and economy. My written testimony includes several recommendations for Congress in this area, including reconstituting a 21st century version of the U.S. Information Agency, augmenting resources to the Broadcasting Board of Governors to bolster China-related content, carrying out Congress's essential role in publicly criticizing China's economic coercion, and providing resources and directing the Department of Defense to develop means to circumvent China's Great Firewall and to make it easier for Chinese citizens to access the global internet. Fifth and finally, we need to develop a stronger toolkit of our own to blunt and deter Chinese economic coercion. Congress can play a leadership role in limiting China's leverage over key nodes in the world economy by developing regulations and export controls that build diversity and redundancy into critical supply chains. Moreover, Congress should call upon relevant U.S. departments and agencies to develop sharper retaliatory tools to deter and impose costs on Chinese companies in the interests of relevant Chinese government officials. In short, As China deploys more sophisticated, nimble, and offensive tools of economic statecraft, so too should we. Senator Markey, I'll stop there and look forward to your questions. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here today.
Okay, great. And we thank both of you for your testimony. And because of the roll calls, I was not able to make my opening statement, which I will do here for a few minutes, awaiting the return of the chairman, and then we will begin the question and answer period. For good reason, Congress has spent considerable time working on the threats from North Korea lately. But for those who follow the Asia-Pacific region closely, and increasingly for those who do not, China has become a significant strategic challenge that demands our attention. We are witnessing a growing Chinese willingness to bend and break long-standing rules, rules that the United States helped create in an effort to spread peace and stability across the globe in the wake of devastating world wars. Rules that created a level playing field and allowed the ingenuity and productivity of American workers to flourish, creating high-paying jobs and expanding our economy. Unfortunately, the Chinese government is undertaking coercive activities across the board, economically, militarily, and politically, that threaten to alter this playing field in China's favor. So, as Chairman Gardner mentioned, we intend to hold a series of hearings on what these developments mean for the United States. And today we are focusing on the Chinese government's coercive activities in the economic realm. There are good reasons why we should be closely following these issues. The Chinese government has used this economic coercion against our allies and partners, undermining U.S. foreign policy. And it has targeted American companies, directly threatening the livelihoods of American workers and expropriating American innovation and ingenuity. Taken together, these actions are eroding the principles of the international rules-based system in an unprecedented way. For example, the Chinese Communist Party is directing targeted economic pressure against smaller countries to achieve specific diplomatic goals. It has even been bold enough to target American allies. In response to an alliance effort to defend South Korea from North Korean missiles, China began an economic pressure campaign targeting the South Korean government and people. This months-long, high-profile campaign reportedly cost the country more than $15 billion in damage. Dollar figures like that tend to change minds, and this blatant coercion should concern us all. And this is not an isolated incident. China has used similar measures against other U.S. allies like Japan and the Philippines, and I fear that we will only see more of this activity in the future. It also is using economic pressure to persuade countries to isolate Taiwan diplomatically and attempting to compel companies to refer to Taiwan as a part of China. According to media reports this morning, U.S. airlines are expected to cave to the Chinese Communist Party's demands for them to refer on their websites to Taiwan as a part of China. Many foreign airlines have already capitulated. And through its Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, China is burdening countries receiving infrastructure loans with debts so extreme that they begin to undermine their own very sovereignty. According to a recent New York Times report, this Belt and Road Initiative amounts to a debt trap for vulnerable countries around the world, fueling corruption and autocratic behavior in struggling democracies. The Chinese government also is targeting U.S. and other foreign companies in its bid to acquire technology that China deems strategically important for its economic development. The list of American companies on the receiving end of China's ever more aggressive economic coercion is long and growing. In one example, American Superconductor, an energy technology company from my home state of Massachusetts that produces chips for wind turbines, partnered with the Chinese company partially owned by the Chinese government, which then stole its intellectual property and used it against them. These practices have victimized numerous other companies in Massachusetts and across the country, including many that do not want to be named for fear of retribution by the Chinese government. This must stop, and the American government must help protect American businesses from being bullied by China. And while the administration has sought to counter some of China's efforts through tariffs, there are broader strategic objectives that we need to keep in mind. Across the board, These coercive measures hurt companies and their workers, damage our international relations, and create vulnerabilities. And they damage the international system that keeps peace and stability. This is not about making China out to be the enemy. And it is not, as China likes to complain, about constraining China's rise, but rather it is about all countries following the rules of the road, because these rules give every country, including China, a chance to prosper and compete from an equitable playing field. So it is of the utmost importance that we stand up for the interests, principles, and values that we care about. There is no place in the modern world for powerful countries coercing others, whether they be smaller neighbors or companies trying to provide for their workers. There simply is no room for the old ways of might makes right. We must ensure that we protect U.S. economic and security interests, as well as the broader international system that has helped provide peace and stability across the globe. The United States cannot afford to cede leadership on this issue. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman. The witnesses have completed their testimony, and we're ready to begin a round of questions.
Thank you, Senator Markey. And again, thank you both for your time and testimony today. And I thank the members for their time in participating in the committee. Mr. Blumenthal, you mentioned in your opening statement, you talked about the economic opening in China being over. Could you go into a little bit more detail of what you mean by that?
So the period of reform and opening, which Deng Xiaoping began in 1978 and allowed for the great growth of China, the great growth of the private sector entrepreneurs, and brought so many Chinese out of poverty and benefited the world, ended probably 10 years ago. The Chinese, we now know, the Chinese have gone back to the state sector dominating, taking out room for entrepreneurs to grow. They've gone back to things like price controls. They've gone back to things like lending on the basis of non-market, non-profitable lending, but rather through patronage from the party to state-owned enterprises. They certainly haven't moved any further than they were 10, 12 years ago on market access, things that we've been pressing for. They haven't stopped subsidizing. In fact, they've doubled down on subsidizing their state-owned enterprises, which is probably the single biggest cause of probably the WTO stalling as much as it has. And Xi Jinping is certainly not taking China down the road of another round of market reforms. Quite the contrary. He's statist and favoring state-owned enterprises and the subsidization of state-owned enterprises over the private sector.
It was the first opportunity I had through the committee to visit China, I think in 2015. And while I was there, I met with a number of U.S. businesses. In those conversations, these U.S. businesses said, just give China more time. There's just a little bit more time than now to see if the reforms will work. And I think you've said it's been about 10 years now where those reforms quit and kind of went back. They've gone back to some of the bad actions of the past. I don't hear the same thing from American businesses today. I don't hear give them time, just wait a little bit longer. What I hear now is that the U.S. needs to act on the predatory economics. You've also talked about coercion. Could you explain the difference between sort of coercion and predatory economics?
Sure. So the Chinese economic system in many ways is set up to be predatory without necessarily trying to fulfill a geopolitical imperative. So when I talk about coercion specifically, I'm talking, for example, about trying to stop U.S. tariffs, to take an example right now. So call in U.S. businesses. Xi Jinping calls in CEOs of U.S. businesses and says, if you don't get the Trump administration to stop these tariffs, your businesses will pay. They can't do business here. We will squeeze them out. That's coercion. The same thing with Taiwan. If you, Taiwan CEO, don't go back to Taiwan and vote for a more pro-Beijing party, you can't do business here. That's coercion. That's trying to obtain a geopolitical objective. The predatory nature of the Chinese economy is just inherent and structurally in the system. the state-owned enterprises and the state banks, lend on a predatory nature, on a non-profitable nature, and the subsidization that they rely so heavily upon in China in order to export is causing structural stresses in the world trade system. So I think that's how I divide it up analytically.
So ports in something like Sri Lanka would be predatory economics.
In that case, it could be both. So if you're setting up, it's predatory in the sense that Sri Lanka needs the funding for the port, and they'll get favorable terms at first from the Chinese, but then the Chinese will come back and call for something in return, like access to a port. It can be coercive if the Sri Lankans don't actually deliver that port, and they can put more and more pressure on the Sri Lankans politically to deliver. So in Sri Lanka is a case, a lot of the BRI cases are cases of both, confluence of both those strategies.
And I mentioned before that I don't hear from U.S. businesses, just wait a little bit longer to see if there's reforms take effect. But yet, as Senator Markey mentioned in his opening dialogue, we do see coercive efforts by China on U.S. airline companies trying to get them to change their websites, a word on a website, toward as it relates to Taiwan. And so that's coercive. That's a coercion tactic. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. That the target there is isolation of Taiwan, using U.S. businesses as a proxy to get at Taiwan.
And what's the ultimate consequence if U.S. businesses like U.S. airlines start capitulating to China and their demands over changing their website? Where does it? What? That's not the end of it, right? It continues. There's something else or something more.
On Taiwan, there's a multifaceted coercive strategy. It involves military coercion that constantly exercises to demonstrate to Taiwan that if they want to, they can cut their economic lifelines off from ports and increasingly in the airspace. They're trying to wipe Taiwan off the mental map of all of us, and that's what they're doing with airlines and other types of companies, as well as websites, and they're trying to get the State Department and others to constantly fighting with them over how to mention Taiwan, the Olympics. What they want to do is wipe Taiwan off the map as a separate entity.
I know in both of your statements you talk about, you make recommendations for policies that we could put in place that would help the United States address the rise of China. And as Senator Markey said, the goal is not to try to make people choose between friends, but to have multiple friends to have in a system that actually abides by international norms and rules of the road that we all agree to. And so I look forward to getting into those recommendations a little bit more. Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Mr. Ratner, where are we in this trade war? Just help us to step back and get a perspective as to where this is likely to lead. The U.S. Department of Agriculture today announced they're planning to announce $12 billion in emergency aid for farmers that were hurt by President Trump's escalating trade war. And obviously, there's going to be a line of other industries' employees who are going to be showing up looking for aid as well as part of this war. We might as well call it kind of a trade defense budget. You need a whole defense budget here. It's not just going to be for the ag sector. It's going to be for every other sector, steel, aluminum, you name it, all the way down the line, are industries affected by those industries who are all going to be looking for some help. So can you talk a little bit, Mr. Ratner, where you see this going in the and what the end game is from your perspective?
Sure, Senator Markey. I mean, I think the direct answer is I think we're about 20 years into this trade war. So this is not something that Donald Trump started. This is something that China started decades ago, and I don't agree with all the ways that the Trump administration is going about dealing with this problem, but I do think they should be commended for highlighting it, and business as usual was not going to work. So it is important, I think, and one of my critiques of the Trump administration is that it was a serious mistake for them to lead with the Section 232 tariffs against our allies and partners, because it muddied the message of Chinese predatory practices, and that's what we should be focused on as a country in terms of our economic strategy as we're thinking forward. That's what the Trump administration should have been talking about from day one, and I worry now that the message is very confused with both the American people and the international community in terms of where the China economic challenge and China's predatory practices.
So you're saying instead of imposing tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, that actually hurts many sectors of our economy, that instead the president should have been focusing on China right from the very beginning. Is that your point?
That's absolutely right. The term that I use to describe the Trump administration's China policy is that it's confrontational without being competitive. That tariffs are quite confrontational, but there's a better basket of tools that we could be using associated with high standard rulemaking, investment restrictions, export controls, public diplomacy, sanctions against particularly bad actors, investing at home, rerouting supply chains, coordinating with allies and partners. There's a whole suite of economic policies we should be making here to be more competitive with China. That's what we should be focused on.
Okay, now do you see any threat that this economic trade war could spill over into national security areas as well?
Depends what you mean by that, sir. I think part of what the Trump administration.
Well, we need the Chinese for cooperation on many national security issues. Do you think this could reduce the likelihood that there would be cooperation where the United States is looking for it most ardently?
I think we may see issue linkage. Certainly both President Xi and President Trump have drawn such issue linkage. I think one of the questions is, what is the goal of the Trump administration here? And they haven't articulated that. There are folks inside in the president himself who talk about trade deficits. There are others who talk about restoring American manufacturing. There are others who talk about tech transfer and intellectual theft. And then there are others who talk about that the goal here is not actually to get a deal that makes our economies more interdependent, but one that leads to less dependence between us, that sees interdependence as the problem. So I think one of the reasons why I like the idea that Senator Young and others have talked about a national economic security strategy is that it would force the administration to be clear about what its aims are and then put forward a strategy to achieve those aims, because we haven't heard that yet clearly from the Trump administration.
So, again, do you think that in the absence of that we could just wind up with a never-ending cycle of increased tariffs on both sides that ultimately harm the global economy, perhaps, while not, in fact, achieving the result which the president says that he is aiming to achieve?
Well, again, I don't think we know what the result is exactly, but certainly tariffs are a blunt instrument. They raise prices for consumers and businesses, and they invite retaliation, and I don't think they're necessarily going to achieve the types of concessions from the Chinese on their industrial policies or their economic model that some are talking about. So to me, they may be a small part of a broader economic policy, but they should not be the central tool of our economic approach to China, which should be predicated on a more competitive strategy by the United States.
So in terms of what the Chinese did to the South Korean economy after the deployment of the THAAD system, hitting it to the tune of $15 billion, what does that teach us about China and its relationship with national security issues from their perspective in terms of linking economic sanctions as a response to those national security issues?
Well, I think what it teaches us, Senator, is that China is going to use its economic clout to try to achieve its geopolitical aims, which include dividing American alliances and eroding the influence of the United States in the region. So I think that was a very important episode. It was very revealing. I think we can talk about trying to incorporate China into a rules-based order. I don't think that's where we're going to be in the next several years. I think what we have to do is pull up our socks, get more competitive, slow down Chinese momentum in its efforts to develop a sphere of influence. That's a much more urgent task than a long-term goal of developing a rules-based order.
All right. Looking at what happened in the Singapore summit, there were reports before Singapore that the Chinese had already increased trade with North Korea, and then there were comments coming out of leadership inside of China that they could now increase trade because of the quote-unquote success of the Singapore summit. How do you view that? How do you view the Chinese in terms of their use of trade or withdrawal of it as a tool in their relationship with the United States, South Korea, but more with the North Koreans?
Well, to link this question with your earlier one, I tend to believe that China's behavior vis-a-vis North Korea is predicated on its own narrow interests as it relates to the peninsula and its geopolitical interests. I don't think they're going to be more or less cooperative on North Korea as a result of U.S. trade policy. In general, I think they may share the hope in the long term of denuclearization of the Korean peninsula, but I don't think they're particularly interested in any kind of instability that might come along with that. So I tend to think they've been looking for any opening to get where we are today, and they're going to push in that direction and essentially support the United States and the Trump administration when it's in their interests and oppose it when they're not.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Markey. Senator Young.
Well, I thank our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Ratner, thanks for your testimony. As I reviewed your written statement, you seem to be making a pretty simple argument with very serious implications. In short, you seem to be saying we're in a high-stakes competition with China, that China does not accept this rules-based international order we had hoped to welcome them into back in 2000. The legitimacy of that order and the institutions that were stood up to oversee that order are not respected by China. China instead respects power. We, as a nation, have insufficient leverage, it seems, to be able to affect the sort of change we want with respect to intellectual property theft, joint licensing requirements, dumping, and so many other things. What we lack, and this is language you employed, is a comprehensive strategy. Is that a fair summary of your viewpoint, Mr. Ratner?
Yes, Senator.
Well, I appreciate your reference in your prepared statement to my legislation, and I, of course, would welcome my colleagues' co-sponsorship. I already know that Senator Gardner has signed on to the National Economic Security Strategy. You've called on Congress to pass this legislation. Why specifically do you believe Congress should pass this legislation? And why do you believe the administration should produce a National Economic Security Strategy?
Senator, my answer would be twofold. First, clearly the economic dimensions of the geopolitical competition are only becoming more important. And I think as we think, it's common to say now that we're seeing the return of great power politics. The role of economics in the strategic competition will be greater, I think, than they were in the past for a variety of reasons, in no small part because that's at the leading edge of Chinese power and influence. So that's where the United States needs to, among other areas, but rise to this challenge. So the economic component is very important, and it's a particular area where our government is not well configured institutionally, and where this particular administration is not coordinating particularly well. And if we're going to get serious about this, we're going to need the government with a coordinated strategy where the different elements are working together and toward the same purposes.
So is it fair to say that you believe that this legislation and the requirement that this and future administrations produce a national economic security strategy would catalyze critical thinking across different departments of government? They would come up, they would synthesize their different priorities and objectives, and that would lead to a coherent and cohesive whole of government economic strategy that would advance our national interests.
I think it could certainly help, Senator. I will say to your last point, I am at times disappointed when the Trump administration is taking actions that don't represent its national security strategy or its national defense strategy, which I think are actually quite good documents. So it doesn't solve the problem in and of itself, but having served in the White House and worked closely with the National Security Council, these planning processes are incredibly important for the kind of coordinating mechanisms you're describing.
So, but any infirmities that might exist in the strategy would then be exposed for lawmakers, academics, and critics alike to remedy in a classified setting where classified annex would be required for the security strategy. Is that how you see this?
Yeah, and frankly, I think there are new tools that the United States is going to need. So this is not just the process of digging up and putting together cobbling together old parts of our strategy. I think we need these processes to bring together the foreign policy and security dimensions of our foreign policy apparatus with the economic and finance dimensions, and that's not something we do well. I will say again, in my time at the White House, in my role as Deputy National Security Advisor to the Vice President, I attended the Deputies Committee meetings. There was an economics pillar to those that were run by an entirely different group of people than the normal national security process, and it led to relatively incoherent policies at times. And those worlds need to be brought together, and this type of strategy process is one way to do that.
Well, what I find coherent in, say, the national security strategy is how they have been able to, through an established process, look across the State Department, Treasury, Department of Defense, and other agencies of government. Their handiwork is synthesized within the National Security Council, and that's what we envision, working hand in glove with the National Security Council and the National Economic Council, doing a similar sort of thing on the economic front. Would there be a signaling function by production of a national economic security strategy? That is, a signaling to our adversaries about what precisely our policy is, and to the American public, who I find consistently asking back in Indiana, whether they're farmers or manufacturers or others, what's the plan?
I think that's right. I think, and just to inverse your question to make the same point, I think the lack of coordination, as I say in my testimony, I think invites Chinese economic coercion because they see those divisions, and I think it makes it harder for companies that are under the duress of Chinese economic coercion to stand up for themselves, because when they look back, they're not sure anyone's behind them standing firm either. So both for our folks and for our competitors, I think it would send an important signal.
Thank you. Mr. Ratner, in your prepared statement, you write, quote, "The United States should be working with, not alienating, allies and partners to address the China challenge." Now, look, I acknowledge that our trading partners could give some with respect to their policies related to trade, other economic policies, regulatory policies, but our differences are marginal in comparison to the state capitalist model that, say, China has adopted. So why do you believe we need international partners like the Europeans, like the Canadians, for example, in addressing China's economic coercion, despite the fact that we may have some differences with those partners?
Well, there are multiple functions that we can do to address Chinese coercion and some of these predatory practices with our partners. One, of course, is sharing information and intelligence, which is a key part of this effort, and then coordinating on things like investment restrictions. For instance, if there were a company from Indiana, whether it was a high-tech company that was trying to be bought by a Chinese company, and CFIUS or its successor were to block that, if the Chinese could then just go to the Europeans and buy a similar technology or a similar company, then your company in Indiana would lose out from that. So I think to maintain our competitiveness and protect our IP is going to be a team effort with our allies and partners. It's not something we can do on our own.
And there's additional leverage as well, which is a related point to yours, right? As we try and bring China closer to what we would consider good behavior or a fair trade model, enhancing our leverage by joining together with the Europeans or our Asian friends and trading partners might make sense. Would you agree with that assessment?
I would agree with that, and when it looked like the United States was going to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership and that agreement was going to pass, the Chinese were starting to ask questions quietly at senior levels with American officials about what they would need to do down the road to improve their practices to join that agreement, and obviously those conversations are no longer happening today.
So lastly, Mr. Chairman, if I could just follow up on that. I noted that one of your recommendations, Mr. Ratner, in your testimony was rejoining TPP or finding a way into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I commend the President of the United States for having indicated that he was open to that prospect in the last State of the Union address. When I was in the House of Representatives, I co-chaired the TTIP caucus. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Caucus. And I wonder, should the United States, to gain more leverage, in addition to the economic benefits, also be vigorously pursuing TTIP negotiations in parallel with some of these other efforts?
Yes, Senator. I think if we were part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and we knitted that together with TTIP, we would be in an extremely strong position in terms of our economic competitive position toward China, and we wouldn't be having these discussions today.
Thank you, sir.
Senator Markey. Thank you, Senator Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Adner, under WTO, is China allowed to offer subsidies to its businesses?
Senator, I'm not a trade lawyer, so I can't get into the weeds of WTO law, but I think the answer is no, and there are several other dimensions in which they're not in compliance with the agreement.
Under the WTO, China is required to do an annual report of all of its subsidies to different enterprises. Does it do that report?
I believe not, Senator.
So when it fails to do the report, we are, under the WTO, allowed to do a report on their subsidies. I did an amendment a few years ago that said if China doesn't produce their report, our trade representative will be directed to produce our report. And before that amendment, the ink could dry on it, our trade rep under President Obama produced a list of 200 Chinese subsidies we were well aware of, but rarely kind of articulated. So we certainly have an understanding of massive Chinese subsidies that are not allowed under WTO. How about to offer loans to at non-market rates?
I believe not, sir.
Or to provide land for free as a form of subsidy?
I think that's right, as well as forced technology transfer and a number of other practices.
And how about being required for our companies to be required to locate in a particular part of China where the infrastructure is inferior to other locations?
Correct.
A couple of years ago, when I was part of a delegation to China, we were at a meeting of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in which many of these practices were highlighted, but one company in particular stood up and said, and I won't name the exact company because they probably didn't want it too much publicized at the time, but they said they were basically told, we have to put our manufacturing center in this far western city, far from the port infrastructure. We are told we cannot build any size of item that is in direct competition with the Chinese items. They were told they only could build larger versions that the Chinese weren't yet building, or they would be shut down and shut out of the country. Is that type of activity by the Chinese legal under the WTO?
No, sir.
And what about requiring American companies to do joint venture arrangements in order to be able to locate in China?
Also, not part of the agreement.
So, and you're familiar with how these joint venture agreements are often used as a way to drain U.S. technology?
Yes, sir.
So what does one say to the American citizen who says, China is violating all of these rules, and the WTO has no mechanism by which we appear to be able to hold them accountable? Why shouldn't we work intensely to create an ability to hold China accountable to the structure of the WTO?
I think that was the intention of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And the WTO was written at a different time. It was never designed for this type of state-led mercantilist power, and it was not designed around investment issues and other e-commerce issues and IP issues that we're facing today. So certainly need for an updating, but again, I think the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was the institutional answer to many of these shortcomings.
Well, perhaps we can have that debate another day, because I don't share your opinion on that. But turning back to the flaws in the WTO, what is the average Chinese tariff on our manufactured goods?
I don't know that off the top of my head, Senator.
Are you familiar in general that their tariffs are significantly more on average on our manufactured goods than our tariffs on theirs?
They are absolutely much, much higher. I think the fact that, again, this is not well known among the American people or in the international community is a shortcoming of our public diplomacy and communications on this issue, and I think we need to think about how we can do a better job of telling this story domestically and internationally. But absolutely, there's clear data on this particular finding.
And the Chinese are continuing to use a lot of state-owned enterprises as a strategy to provide subsidies that are rather hidden. So Under the WTO, if China engages in these practices and says to our companies, you have to be part of a joint venture, why don't we say, well, China, you want to locate in the U.S., you have to be part of a joint venture. Why should we give them such easy access when they're putting up such fierce obstacles to our investments in China?
I don't think we should, and I think these types of reciprocal rules would be fair and would likely cause them to change their practices in certain ways. I think the fact that they've been able to get away with these kinds of practices for so long and take advantage of our open markets is what all of us collectively are trying to solve here. But I think a principle of reciprocity is a great one to apply to this problem.
In my various trips to China, I've seen China with bicycles, I've seen China with cars, and now I've seen China with bullet trains. Massive new metro systems being built across the country, roads, bridges. Meanwhile, they're investing massively in defense. They're proceeding to buy up strategic minerals around the world. They're proceeding to buy into a lot of companies in the United States. Is China eating our lunch?
I don't think they're eating our lunch. I think they are, one of the things that I like to remind folks, and I know you all share this confidence, and I put in my statement, is that we ought to keep reminding ourselves that the foundations of American power are strong. And the reason why, if they are eating our lunch, I think we are losing this strategic competition among almost every parameter of the, whether it's economic or military or informational or ideological, is primarily because we're not competing. I think if we got our act together, we'd be doing just fine.
As long as our market is very open to the Chinese, and as long as they can pay wages that are much lower than ours and have environmental laws that are virtually non-existent or non-enforced, isn't it always going to be pretty much cheaper for manufacturers to move their manufacturing to China or to other states that have similar low wage, low enforcement, low environmental standards?
I think that's right, which is, again, it sounds like we have differences about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but one aspect of that was to increase labor standards and environmental standards and otherwise, so as to prevent countries from being able to race to the bottom and to level the playing field for American workers.
Well, just as a reminder, we were giving Malaysia access, which has some of the worst labor standards in the world. But that's a conversation for another day. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Markey. And this discussion on the TTIP and TPP, I think, is very important because I think we've laid out a lot of concerns we have with Chinese predatory economics, Chinese coercion, state-owned enterprises, market access requirements. There were reports several months ago about requiring certain people to be in the chain of command of a business that's located in China. Obviously, technology transfers are a part of it. And that's how the administration responded through. That's why the administration responded through, at least in part, the tariffs that it has. But I believe a more appropriate action would have been to get global communities, like-minded interest allies together through Trans-Pacific Partnership and other trade agreements to put pressure and isolate China. Do you agree, Mr. Ratner?
Absolutely, Senator Gardner. I think that's the path forward. I think from a strategic perspective, it's the obvious solution. From a political perspective, it's more difficult, but this one's a no-brainer.
Mr. Blumenthal?
I just have to correct a few things on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Free trade is, mostly to the good, but it would do nothing on Chinese coercive practices. We have a free trade agreement with South Korea, and yet it was the target of some of the harshest coercive practices in Asia. The TPP is gone. And it's becoming kind of an excuse to do nothing else. We have to take on Chinese coercive practices directly in ways that hurt the Chinese Communist Party, and we know how to do that. We have enormous leverage over China. China is stagnating as an economy. China's dependent on the U.S. consumer. I hope we don't go full bore into a tariff war, but they will lose because they export more than we do. So the answer to everything nowadays seems to be the TPP, that again, may be a good, intrinsic good in and of itself, may or may not, that's debatable, but it's not the answer to Chinese coercive practices.
Well, I think it's important to point out to you that when it comes to South Korea, I believe, at least in the Korean National Assembly conversations I had, members of that legislative body, that the retaliation for THAAD cost around $12 billion
Right.
to South Korea's economy,
Right.
including
Right.
we still have cores. So I think you make an interesting point. I do want to get into, though, remedies. And Mr. Ratner, when you say that the foundations of U.S. leadership are strong, I think that's incredibly important. We shouldn't be, walking around with our heads down on this. That's why I want to get into remedies. So Mr. Blumenthal, then followed by Mr. Ratner, if you'd like to talk about some remedies that we should be pursuing, how should we be responding to denials of market access? How should we be responding to the theft and forced transfer of intellectual property? A lot of talk goes into reciprocity. Is there an understanding of what reciprocity would look like and what effect it would have, or would the message be lost?
Well, first of all, I disagree that there's no strategy. For the first time, the national security strategy mentioned China as a strategic competitor, had a big part of it that's protecting the national innovation base. These tariffs are coming out of a Section 301 investigation that took a year and a half, that was getting bipartisan acclaim. So, and then next week, we're unveiling a big free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, part of which is building resiliency in the countries that are most targeted. So there's nothing you can do if in Indonesia, for example, they're open to bribery, except to build the rule of law in Indonesia. Mm-hmm. The Trans-Pacific Partnership can't do anything about that. That is the work that the State Department's going to roll out next week. What you can do remedy-wise is, again, go out.
But I do think strong standards, though, in agreements like TPP will help force people to.
It could. But it's also the work of State Department, USAID, and things that you'll see rolled out next week in terms of resiliency within. Any other strategies on top of that are obviously welcome. But again, if we want to, the era of to a certain extent of strategies, or the Chinese broke the WTO. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was a response to a broken WTO. The era of more documentation is over. It's time to go after CCP entities that are benefiting.
What should we do in the case of denial of market access?
So we should pick some of the companies that have benefited the most from IP theft or forced technology transfer, and through the enhanced CFIUS process that is already passing its way through the Congress and working with the Treasury, deny them access to the U.S. market in coordination with the European market. That's how you get results from Xi Jinping. You target things that he cares about.
Mr. Ratner?
Senator, I guess one thing I would say, another thing that I mentioned in my written testimony, is that I do think it's important that as we think about any discrete China challenge, whether it's their predatory practices, the South China Sea, human rights, et cetera, what we need is a comprehensive strategy across the board. And that's what we need, rather than simply sort of specific targeted responses only to these problems. So we need to be thinking about the entire pie here. And again, you stepped out of the room, but thank you for the legislation that you're leading on this, and it's important, and the fact that it is comprehensive across military and economic and human rights and government's exactly what we need to be doing. So I would be thinking of these in terms of a comprehensive package. But as it relates to the targeted piece, I completely agree with Dan. TPP is not the complete answer. It should be part of a broader answer set. I think I would start with investment restrictions. I think the fact that, as you know, the 301 decision was meant to include potentially both tariffs as well as investment restrictions, and the Treasury Department, Secretary Mnuchin came back with nothing on the investment restriction side, and I think that's quite disappointing, particularly as the new CFIUS reforms will take time to get implemented. So I would start with investment restrictions, in whether it's related to reciprocal areas or areas that we're worried about for economic security or military security reasons. I think we ought to tighten up, as I know Congress is doing, our export control laws so that American companies actually can't transfer their technology even if they want to. I agree with Dan. We need to think about sanctions against companies that have benefited from IP theft. There's an executive order on the books that was put in place during the Obama's second term that has not been used against Chinese companies, even though Treasury has packages ready to go, and I think it's unacceptable that we haven't employed that executive order yet. And I think we need to think about regulations to diversify supply chains, and again, coordinating with our allies and partners. It's going to take a whole suite of policies. But I do agree with Dan that the retaliatory tools are ones that we need to think about. And if China is threatening American airlines, then or U.S. airlines, then we ought to have tools in our back pocket, again, whether it's sanctions or antitrust statutes or licensing agreements, that we can say quietly to the Chinese, if you do that, we're going to do this. And until they see that, what incentive they have not to keep going down this road. So we need to be able to strike back in a way that's nimble and offensive.
Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. ZTE, President Trump says he wants to be tough on China, call them into account, but then he tweets out, Commerce Department should find a way to give ZTE, quote, a way to get back into business fast. And that's despite the serious security issues that were raised by Trump national security officials themselves, that there were violations of American sanctions, widespread bribery committed by the company to expand its footprint. For both of you, do you believe that China is going to, in fact, receive the wrong message by not imposing tough measures on ZTE because of its, because of its allegedly close relationship with President Xi, and as a result, it's going to escape the types of sanctions that would have sent a strong message to the Chinese economic sector that no games are going to be allowed to be played in the future. Mr. Ratner or Mr. Blumenthal?
GT is a big mistake. It's a violator of sanctions and also a threat to U.S. national security. But I think right now we're focusing a lot on the U.S. reverberations from the tariffs. We're not focusing enough on how much China's suffering and how much of a panic they're in about these tariffs. So I don't think she in any way views Trump as a partner on economics. I think they got idiosyncratically got a pass on ZTE, but I think she very much views Trump as somebody who's going to harm the Chinese economy. If they can't export these goods, that's what their economy is based on.
Mr. Ratner.
I think
Mr. Blumenthal thinks it's a mistake. Do you think it's a mistake?
I think it was a mistake. I think it's important to send the message that we're going to implement our laws and hold these companies accountable. I will say there are experts who have told me privately that when it comes to ZTE, if we had taken that action, they would have reconstituted the company under another name over which we would have no penalties and no control. And that it's actually better, the devil you know is better than the devil that you don't know. I don't know if that's a correct argument or not. I think it's worthy of consideration, but separate from that detail, I do think we should be approaching this as a law enforcement matter. They violated export control laws, and they ought to face punishment for it. And the idea that they can somehow buy their way out of these violations sends a really disturbing signal.
So what are the implications of this, though? That we're seeing this erosion of response from the West, including airlines, which are now all going to be forced to change the way in which they designate landing in Taiwan. So what does that mean in terms of this never-ending, inexorable pressure which China is applying in the private sector in order to enhance its overall leverage in its relationship with everyone, including us?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. I think the question of what does it mean for the future is the right question, because often in these instances, the specific near-term economic consequence is not what matters. What matters is that down the road, countries or companies are going to be self-deterred from standing up to China, and that's what I worry about. And I think we see that every day of the week now in the South China Sea. It's what we see on human rights, even in countries in Europe that should know better. I think there, as I said, there's been a chilling effect from this type of intimidation, and I think if the United States doesn't lead the way on standing up to it, then we're only going to see it get worse and worse as time goes on.
All right, so for you, Mr. Blumenthal, China's Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to position China as the, quote, uncontested leading power in Asia, may further coerce its neighbors through loans that they can't repay. So, for example, in a highly publicized example, Sri Lanka's government struggled to make payments on the debt it had taken on as part of a deal with China. Under heavy pressure and after months of negotiations with the Chinese, the government handed over Hambantota Port and 15,000 acres of land around it to a Chinese company partially owned by the Chinese government for 99 years. Transferring this land gives China control of territory near India and a strategically important commercial and military waterway. And this is but one example of what appears to be a growing trend around the world with regard to a Chinese leveraging of their economic might as a way of then extracting concessions that have longer-term profound implications. So what are the risks of increased debt burden amongst companies and countries receiving loans from the Chinese, Mr. Blumenthal?
It's very high. I'd also point out, though, that BRI is a mixed bag for China. So China is incredibly indebted, probably 270, 280, something like that % of GDP. And a lot of what BRI is forcing debt-burdened Chinese state-owned enterprise is to go and invest or do construction in places that otherwise other countries wouldn't do, and draw down their foreign reserves to do so. So there's certain cases where we should just ignore and tell the Chinese, please go ahead, do construction in Pakistan as much as you would like. When it comes to strategically placed countries like Sri Lanka or Bangladesh or certain countries in the Gulf, that's a different story because they are indeed trading investment on bad terms for those countries. Well, first for good terms, but then with a cost for access, strategic access, and for geostrategic space.
Okay, Mr. Ratner?
I would agree with most of that. I think, again, the Chinese are making progress with BRI in part because of as a communications strategy and a public relations win, and it's incumbent upon us to do some level setting about the facts on the ground. That being said, I think it's important also that the United States put forward its own positive vision. I think the Trump administration, as I understand it, is thinking about ways to do that with the BUILD Act and strategic use of foreign assistance, and I'm hopeful that they'll come forward with some demonstration projects that put forward what U.S. And Western development looks like in terms of being environmentally safe and anti-corruption and skills transfer and good governance and all of these issues. So we need to put something forward in comparison. We can't just spend our time criticizing what they're doing out there.
Okay, great. And we thank both of the witnesses, and I want to thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for your great work on the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act. I think it's something that hopefully can bring our committee and the Congress together in backing before the end of the year. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Senator Markey. Thank you to the witnesses. I think as we wrap this up, do you have
yes,
a question?
No.
Yeah. I think just to leave the concern that we started with, and that is what we can do to show U.S. leadership to make sure that we don't fall behind. In recent writings in the Wall Street Journal, quotes from President Xi, China has its own ideas about how the world should be run, and as he put it, to lead in the reform of global governance. Another quote, or another statement, in at least 8 African countries, as well as some in Southeast Asia, Chinese officials are training their counterparts in how to manage political stability through propaganda and how to control media and the internet, and that the China model provides a new option for other countries who want to speed up their development while preserving their independence. And finally this, China has committed to train 10,000 political elites in Latin America by 2020. All of this speaks to the need for what you have described, Mr. Ratner, what you have described, Mr. Blumenthal, is U.S. leadership and U.S. response. Whether it's the BUILD Act, whether it's legislation that Senator Young has described, the legislation that we have co-sponsored together, the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, this is a time for U.S. leadership. And it's a time to stand boldly for our values that have empowered the world to be a better place, that has lifted up hundreds of millions of people around the globe up and out of poverty through a system of rules and standards that don't favor one country over another, but that give people a chance to participate in global governance and that global rise. So now is the time for U.S. leadership. I thank both of you for your time and testimony today. And I have a homework assignment here today somewhere. If I can find my closing script here. Basically, we will keep the record open till the end of the week. I think I'm screwing it up here. We're going to hold the record open till Thursday afternoon. If members have questions for the record, they'll submit them. I would ask for your prompt response. They will be made a part of the record. And with that, the thanks to this committee, this hearing is adjourned.